Chapter 21. Kunta's Kafo, galled with envy of his trip, and expecting that he would return to Jafur all puffed up with himself, had decided, without any of them actually saying so, to show no interest whatever in him or his travels when he returned. And so they did, thinking nothing of how heartsick it made Kunta feel to arrive home and find his lifelong mates not acting as if he hadn't been away, but actually ending conversations if he came near, his dearest friend Sitafa acting even colder than the others. Kunta was so upset that he hardly even thought about his new infant brother, Suwadu, who had been born while he was away with Amoro. One noon, as the goats grazed, Kunta finally decided to overlook his mates' unkindness and try to patch things up. Walking over to the other boys, who were sitting apart from him eating their lunches, he sat down among them and simply began talking. "I wish you could have been with me," he said quietly, and without waiting for their reaction, began to tell them about the trip. He told how hard the days of walking had been, how his muscles had ached, about his fright in passing the lions, and he described the different villages he had passed through and the people who lived there. While he spoke, one of the boys jumped up to regroup his goats, and when he returned, without seeming to notice, sat down closer to Kunta. Soon Kunta's words were being accompanied by grunts and exclamations from the others, and before they knew it, just at that point in his story when he reached his uncle's new village, the time had come to drive the goats homeward. The next morning in the schoolyard, all of the boys had to strain not to let the Arafangs suspect their impatience to leave. Finally out again with their goats, they huddled around Kunta, and he began to tell them about the different tribes and languages all intermingled in his uncle's village. He was in the middle of one of the tales of faraway places that Jannah and Saloum had told around the campfire, the boys hanging raptly on every word, when the stillness of the fields was broken by the ferocious barking of a wolo dog and the shrill, terrified bleating of a goat. Springing upright, they saw over the edge of the tall grass a great, tawny panther dropping a goat from his jaws and lunging at two of their wolo dogs. The boys were still standing there, too shocked and scared to move, when one of the dogs was flung aside by the panther's sweeping paw. As the other dog leapt wildly back and forth, the panther crouched to spring, their horrible snarlings drowning out the frantic barking of the other dogs and the cries of the other goats, which were bounding off in all directions. Then the boys fanned out, shouting and running, most trying to head off the goats. But Kunta bolted blindly toward his father's fallen goat. "Stop, Kunta! No!" screamed Sitafa as he tried to stop him from running between the dogs and the panther. He couldn't catch him, but when the panther saw the two yelling boys rushing at him, he backed off a few feet, then turned and raced back toward the forest with the enraged dogs at his heels. The panther's stink and the mangled nanny goat made Kunta sick. Blood was running darkly down her twisted neck. Her tongue lolled out. Her eyes were rolled back in her head and, most horribly, her belly was ripped wide open, and Kunta could see her unborn kid inside, still slowly pulsing. Nearby was the first wolo dog, whining in pain from its gashed side and trying to crawl toward Kunta. Vomiting where he stood, Kunta turned, ashen, and looked at Sitafa's anguished face. Dimly, through his tears, Kunta sensed some of the other boys around him, staring at the hurt dog and the dead goat. Then slowly they all drew back, all but Sitafa, who put his arms around Kunta. None of them spoke, but the question hung in the air. How is he going to tell his father? Somehow Kunta found his voice. "Can you care for my goats?" he asked Sitafa. "I must take this hide to my father." Sitafa went over and talked with the other boys, and two of them quickly picked up and carried off the whimpering dog. Kunta then motioned Sitafa to go away with the others, kneeling by the dead nanny goat with his knife. Kunta cut and pulled and cut again. as he had seen his father do it, until finally he rose with the wet hide in his hands. Pulling weeds, he covered over the nanny's carcass and the unborn kid, and started back toward the village. Once before he had forgotten his goats while herding, and he had vowed never to let it happen again. But it had happened again, and this time a nanny goat had been killed. Desperately, he hoped it was a nightmare and that he'd awaken now, but the wet hide was in his hands. He wished death upon himself, but he knew his disgrace would be taken among the ancestors. Allah must be punishing him for boasting, Kunta thought with shame. He stopped to kneel toward the way the sun rose and prayed for forgiveness. Rising, he saw that his kafo had all the goats herded back together and were getting ready to leave the grazing area, lifting their headloads of firewood. One boy was carrying the injured dog, and 2 of the other dogs were limping badly. Sitafa, seeing Kunta looking toward them, put his headload down and started toward Kunta, but quickly Kunta waved him away again to go on with the rest. Each footstep along the worn goat trail seemed to take Kunta closer to the end of everything. Guilt and terror and numbness washed over him in waves. He would be sent away. He would miss Binta, Laman, and old Neoboto. He would even miss the Arafang's class. He thought of his late Grandma Yesa, of his holy man grandfather whose name he bore, now disgraced, of his famous traveling uncles who had built a village. He remembered that he had no headload of firewood. He thought of the nanny goat, whom he remembered well, always skittish and given to trotting off from the rest, and he thought of the kid not yet born. And while he thought of all these things, he could think of nothing but what he most feared to think of, his father. His mind lurched, and he stopped, rooted, not breathing, staring ahead of him down the path. It was Amaro, running toward him. No boy had dared tell him. How had he known? "Are you all right?" his father asked. Kunta's tongue seemed cleaved to the roof of his mouth. "Yes, Fa," he said finally. But by then Amaro's hand was exploring Kunta's belly, discovering that the blood soaking his dundiko wasn't Kunta's. Straightening, Amaro took the hide and laid it on the grass. "Sit down," he ordered, and Kunta did, trembling as Amaro sat across from him. "There is something you need to know," said Amaro. "All men make mistakes. I lost a goat to a lion when I was of your reigns." Pulling at his tunic, Amaro bared his left hip. The pale, deeply scarred place there shocked Kunta. "I learned, and you must learn. Never run toward any dangerous animal." His eyes searched Kunta's face. "Do you hear me?" "Yes, Fa." Amaro got up, took the goat's hide, and flung it far off into the brush. "Then that is all that needs to be said." Kunta's head reeled as he walked back to the village behind Amaro. Greater even than his guilt and his relief was the love he felt for his father at that moment. Chapter 22. Kunta had reached his 10th reign, and the second Kafo boys his age were about to complete the schooling they had received twice daily since they were 5 reigns old. When the day of graduation came, the parents of Kunta and his mates seated themselves in the Arafang's schoolyard, beaming with pride in the very front rows, even ahead of the village elders. While Kunta and the others squatted before the Arafang, the village Alimamo prayed. Then the Arafang stood and began looking around at his pupils as they waved their hands to be asked a question. Kunta was the first boy he chose. "What was the profession of your forefathers, Kunta Kinti?" he asked. "Hundreds of reigns ago in the land of Mali," Kunta confidently replied. "The Kinti men were blacksmiths, and their women were makers of pots and weavers of cloth." With each pupil's correct answer, all those assembled made loud sounds of pleasure. Then the Arafang asked a mathematical question. "If a baboon has 7 wives, each wife has 7 children, and each child eats 7 ground nuts for 7 days, how many nuts did the baboon steal from some man's farm?" After much frantic figuring with grass quill pens on their cottonwood slates, the first to yelp out the right answer was Sitefasila, and the crowd's shouting of praise drowned out the groans of the other boys. Next, the boys wrote their names in Arabic, as they had been taught, and one by one the Arafang held up the slates for all the parents and other spectators to see for themselves what education had achieved. Like the other boys, Kunta had found the marks that talk even harder to read than they were to write. Many mornings and evenings, with the Arafang rapping their knuckles, they had all wished that writing was as easy to understand as the talking drum, which even those of Lamin's age could read as if someone standing beyond sight were calling out the words. One by one now, the Arafang asked each graduate to stand. Finally came Kunta's turn. Kunta Kinti. With all eyes upon him, Kunta felt the great pride of his family in the front row, even of his ancestors in the burying ground beyond the village, most especially of his beloved Grandma Yesa. Standing up, he read aloud a verse from the Qur'an's last page. Finishing, he pressed it to his forehead and said, "Amen." When the readings were done, the teacher shook each boy's hand and announced loudly that as their education was complete, these boys were now of the third kafo, and everyone broke out into a loud cheering. Binta and the other mothers quickly removed the covers from the bowls and calabashes they had brought, heaped with delicious foods, and the graduation ceremony ended in a feast that soon emptied both. Amara was waiting the next morning when Kunta came to take the family's goats out for the day's grazing. Pointing to a fine young male and female, Amaro said, "These two are your school finishing present." Almost before Kunta could stammer out his thanks, Amaro walked away without another word, as if he gave away a pair of goats every day, and Kunta tried very hard not to seem excited. But the moment his father was out of sight, Kunta whooped so loud that his new charges jumped and started running, with all the others in hot pursuit. By the time he caught up with them and herded them out to the fields, the rest of his mates were already there, showing off their own new goats. Treating them like sacred animals, the boys steered their charges to only the most tender grasses, already picturing the strong young kids they would soon produce, and the kids would have soon after, until each boy had a herd as large and valuable as his father's. Before the next new moon appeared, Amoro and Binta were among the parents who gave away a third goat, this one to the Arafang, as an expression of gratitude for their son's education. If they had been more prosperous, they would have been glad to give even a cow, but they knew he understood that this was beyond their means, as it was beyond the means of everyone in Jafur, which was a humble village. Indeed, some parents, new slaves with nothing saved, had little to offer but their own backs, and their grateful gift of a moon's farm work for the Arafang was graciously accepted. The passing moons soon flowed into seasons until yet another rain had passed and Kunta's Kafo had taught Lamin's Kafo how to be goat herds. A time long awaited now drew steadily nearer. Not a day passed that Kunta and his mates didn't feel both anxiety and joy at the approach of the next harvest festival, which would end with the taking away of the third Kafo, those boys between 10 and 15 reigns in age, to a place far away from Jafur, to which they would return, after 4 moons, as men. Kunta and the others tried to act as if none of them were really giving the matter any particular thought or concern, but they thought of little else, and they watched and listened for the slightest sign or word from a grown-up that had anything at all to do with manhood training. And early in the dry season, after several of their fathers quietly left Jafur for 2 or 3 days and just as quietly returned, the boys whispered tensely among themselves, especially after Kalilu Conte overheard his uncle say that much-needed repairs had been made on the Jujuo, the manhood training village that had gone unused and exposed to weather and animals for almost 5 rains since the last training had been completed there. Even more exciting whispering followed talk among their fathers about which elder might be selected by the council of elders to be the Kintango, the man in charge of manhood training. Kunta and all of his mates had many times heard their fathers, uncles, and older brothers speaking reverently of the Kintangos who had supervised their own manhood training many rains before. It was just before the harvest season when all of the 3rd Kafo boys reported to one another in a fever of excitement how their mothers had silently measured each of them with a sewing tape around his head and down to his shoulders. Kunta did his best to hide the vivid memory of that morning 5 rains before when, as brand new little goat herds, he and his mates had been scared nearly out of their wits as they watched screaming boys under white hoods being kicked and jeered from the village by a band of terrifyingly masked, shrieking, spear-carrying, cankering dancers. The Tobalo soon boomed out the beginning of the new harvest, and Kunta joined the rest of the villagers in the fields. He welcomed the long days of hard work, for they kept him too busy and too tired to give much thought to what lay ahead. But when the harvesting was done and the festival began, he found himself unable to enjoy the music and the dancing and the feasting as the others did, as he himself had done for as long as he could remember. The louder the merriment, in fact, the unhappier he became, until finally he spent most of the last 2 days of the festival sitting by himself on the banks of the Bolong, skipping stones across the water. On the night before the last day of the festival, Kunta was in Binta's hut silently finishing his evening meal of groundnut stew with rice when Amora walked in behind him. From the corner of his eye, Kunta glimpsed his father raising something white, and before he had a chance to turn around, Amora had pulled a long hood down firmly over his head. The terror that shot through Kunta all but numbed him. He felt his father's hand gripping his upper arm and urging him to stand up, then to move backward until he was pushed down onto a low stool. Kunta was grateful to sit, for his legs felt like water and his head felt light. He listened to himself breathing in short gasps, knowing that if he tried to move, he would fall off the stool. So he sat very still, trying to accustom himself to the darkness. Terrified as he was, it seemed almost a double darkness. As his upper lip felt the moist warmth of his breath inside the hood, it flashed through Kunta's mind that surely once such a hood had been thrust in the same way over his father's head. Could Amoro have been so frightened? Kunta couldn't even imagine that, and he felt ashamed to be such a disgrace to the Kinti clan. It was very quiet in the hut. Wrestling the fear that knotted the pit of his stomach, Kunta closed his eyes and focused his very pores on trying to hear something, anything at all. He thought he heard Binta moving about, but he couldn't be sure. He wondered where Lamin was, and Suwadu, who surely would be making noise. He knew only one thing for sure. Neither Binta nor anyone else was going to speak to him, let alone lift that hood off his head. And then Kunta thought how awful it would be if his hood did get lifted, for anyone would see how scared he really was, and perhaps therefore a boy unworthy of joining his Kafo mates in manhood training. Even boys the size of Lamin knew, since Kunta had told him, what would happen to anyone who showed himself too weak or cowardly to endure the training that boys turned into hunters, into warriors, into men, all within a period of 12 moons. Somehow he should fail? He began gulping down his fear, remembering how he had been told that any boy who failed the manhood training would be treated as a child for the rest of his life, even though he might look like a grown man. He would be avoided, and his village would never permit him to marry, lest he father others like himself. These sad cases, Kunta had heard, usually slipped away from their villages sooner or later, never to return, and even their own fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters would never mention them again. Kunta saw himself slinking away from Jafur like some mangy hyena, scorned by everyone. It was too horrible to think of. After a time, Kunta realized that he was faintly hearing the drumbeats and the shouting of dancers in the distance. More time passed. What hour was it, he wondered. He guessed it must be near the Sutoba hour, halfway between dusk and dawn. But after a few moments, he heard the Alimamo's high-pitched wailing for the village's Safo prayer, 2 hours before midnight. The music ceased, and Kunta knew that the villagers had stopped their celebrating and the men were hastening to the mosque. Kunta sat until he knew the prayers must have been over. But the music didn't resume. He listened hard, but could hear only silence. Finally, he nodded off, awakening with a start only a few minutes later. It was still quiet, and darker under the hood than a moonless night. Finally, faintly, he was certain that he could hear the early yippings of hyenas. He knew that hyenas always yipped for a while before settling down to steady howling, which they would continue until early daybreak, sounding eerily far away. During the harvest festival week, at the first streaks of daybreak, Kunta knew the tobalo would boom. He sat waiting for that to happen, for anything to happen. He felt his anger building, expecting the tobalo to sound at any moment, but nothing happened. He grated his teeth and waited some more, and then, at last, after jerking awake a few times, he dozed off into a fitful sleep. He all but leapt from his skin when the tobalo finally did boom. Under the hood, his cheeks were hot with embarrassment that he had fallen asleep. Having become accustomed to the hood's darkness, Kunta could all but see the morning's activities from the sounds his ears picked up. The crowing of the cocks, the barking of the wolo dogs, the wailing of the alimamo, the bumping of the women's pestles as they beat the breakfast couscous. This morning's prayer to Allah, he knew, would be for the success of the manhood training that was about to begin. He heard movement in the hut, and he sensed that it was Binta. It was strange how he couldn't see her, but he knew it was his mother. Kunta wondered about Sitafa and his other mates. It surprised him to realize that throughout the night, he hadn't once thought about them until now. He told himself that they must surely have had as long a night as he had. When the music of koras and balafons began playing outside the hut, Kunta heard the sound of people walking and talking, louder and louder. Then drums joined the din, their rhythm sharp and cutting. A moment later, his heart seemed to stop as he sensed the sudden movement of someone rushing into the hut. Before he could even brace himself, his wrists were grabbed, and roughly he was snatched up from the stool and jerked out through the hut door into the all but deafening noise of staccato drums and screeching people. Hands knocked him and feet kicked him. Kunta thought desperately of bolting away somehow, but just as he was about to try, a firm yet gentle hand grasped one of his. Breathing hoarsely under his hood, Kunta realized that he was no longer being hit and kicked and that the screaming of the crowd was suddenly no longer nearby. The people, he guessed, had moved along to some other boy's hut, and the guiding hand that held his must belong to the slave Amaro would have hired, as every father did, to lead his hooded son to the jujuo. The crowd's shouting rose to a frenzied pitch every time another boy was dragged from a hut, and Kunta was glad he couldn't see the cankering dancers, who were making blood-curdling whoops as they sprang high into the air brandishing their spears. Big drums and small drums, every drum in the village it seemed, were pounding as the slave guided Kunta faster and faster between rows of people shouting on either side of him, crying out things like, "4 moons!" and "They will become men!" Quinta wanted to burst into tears. He wished wildly that he could reach out and touch Amoro, Binta, Lamin, even the sniveling Suwadu, for it felt too much to bear that 4 long moons were going to pass before he would see again those he loved even more than he had ever realized until now. Quinta's ears told him that he and his guide had joined a moving line of marchers, all stepping to the swift rhythm of the drums. As they passed through the village gates, he could tell because the noise of the crowd began to fade. He felt hot tears well up and run down his cheeks. He closed his eyes tight, as if to hide the tears even from himself. As he had felt Binta's presence in the hut, now he felt, almost as if it were a smell, the fear of his Kafo mates ahead and behind him in line, and he knew that theirs was as great as his. Somehow that made him feel less ashamed. As he trudged on in the white blindness of his hood, he knew that he was leaving behind more than his father and his mother and his brothers in the village of his birth, and this filled him with sadness as much as terror. But he knew it must be done, as it had been done by his father before him and would some day be done by his son. He would return, but only as a man.